for studying for the exam. Now, I always start out with these body systems looking at the primary function of each system. Now, obviously, the primary function of the respiratory system is to obtain oxygen, right? We've talked all about the importance of oxygen throughout all the other body systems. Oxygen is really, really important because we need it to burn sugar. Okay, literally, the reaction that happens in our mitochondria, it is a combustion reaction. We're taking sugar, which is a hydrocarbon, C6H12O6, and we're combining it with oxygen. And what we get out after is carbon dioxide and water vapor. Okay, so just like in your car, when you burn octane in the presence of oxygen, our cells are doing that with sugar. And to do that efficiently, we need oxygen. You can go for 3, 4, 5 days without drinking. Okay, eventually the toxins will build up and it'll overwhelm your organs, but you can go a number of days. You can go weeks without eating. Remember when we talked about macromolecules and digestion, we are able to store sugar as glycogen. We're able to store sugar in fat. And, in a panic situation, we can even burn our proteins. We can disassemble our proteins and amino acids to get carbohydrates. So we can go weeks without food. But you can only go minutes without oxygen. Okay, without oxygen, cells die very quickly. So the primary function of the respiratory system is to obtain that oxygen from the air. And then we need to also eliminate carbon dioxide, which is a waste product of that cellular respiration reaction. And again, carbon dioxide, as we'll see in this chapter, if it builds up in our blood, it takes the place of oxygen. It also makes our blood very acidic, and that's not good, right? Proteins don't function, enzymes don't function if our pH gets out of our homeostatic balance. Now, the way that our respiratory system functions, bringing in air and getting rid of carbon dioxide, bringing in oxygen, getting rid of carbon dioxide, it's contingent on certain muscles working that help to power that process. So we have muscles between our ribs. We have a flat muscle underneath our lungs called the diaphragm. And we need these muscles to work in order to allow air to get in and out of our body. Now, in addition to needing muscles to make the whole process work, muscles are actually the most metabolically active tissue in our body. What that means is they use up the most oxygen in our body. So remember, the picture that I have here, that's showing the skeletal muscles. So those are muscles that are attached to your skeleton, right? You can see the large muscles of the quadricep, and you can see the pectoral muscles, and you can see the biceps and the triceps, and the latissimus dorsi in the back, and you can see the brachialis muscles in the forearm, and all that kind of stuff. Those muscles need a lot of oxygen to run. We also have muscles in our heart. We have muscles, like I said, in our diaphragm. We have muscles that line our stomach and muscles that line our GI tract. So all of these muscles have lots of mitochondria, and they use a tremendous amount of oxygen. Now, there are phases that our respiratory system goes through in obtaining the oxygen that we need to fuel those muscles and fuel our brain and our other organs. Okay, so the 3 phases of gas exchange include, number 1, respiration. So this is different than what I just mentioned, the reaction called cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is one thing, that's a reaction that occurs in our mitochondria. But respiration includes gas exchange in a large moist surface, okay, which we'll see later is our lungs. Okay, so respiration includes exchange across the membranes of our lungs. That's phase 1. Phase 2, we need to take that oxygen that is now diffused out of our lungs into our blood, and we need to transport it throughout the body. And this is where hemoglobin and erythrocytes come in. Remember erythrocytes? What's the other name for erythrocytes? Does anybody remember out there? Jog your brain a little bit. Erythrocytes are our red blood cells. Red blood cells have hemoglobin attached to them, and the hemoglobin helps to carry oxygen. Okay, so that oxygen is transported to our body tissues, and then once the oxygen is transported, it is then exchanged. Okay, so that's phase 3. So oxygen enters into the cell, and CO2, carbon dioxide, leaves the cell and enters into the blood, where the blood will be circulated back to the lungs, where we have exchange again. Okay, so 3 phases to gas exchange: respiration, transport, and then tissue exchange, which happens at the cellular level. So take a minute here and please fill out the diagram on the front of your note package. You will definitely have to know the anatomy of the respiratory system, and you will have to be able to trace the path of air from the outside world down to where we have respiration take place. So I'll give you 3 minutes to label this diagram. All right, so we're going to look at the parts of the respiratory system here today, and we'll look at a little bit about muscles. But before we get into things, what I'd like to just show using my pen here is the direction that air flows into our bodies. So air can either enter through the nose, okay, where it enters into a large space in the back of our face, kind of behind our eyes and behind our forehead, called the nasal cavity. So air can enter in through there where it's warmed and moistened and cleaned. It then kind of passes down through the back of our throat, which is known as our pharynx. Pharynx. Okay. It then passes over our voice box called our larynx, and then down into this front tube, past the epiglottis. I don't know if you guys remember the epiglottis from digestion. It's right here, the epiglottis. And that epiglottis is like a flap, right? It allows food to pass down into the esophagus and tries to keep it out of the airway. So the airway is known as the trachea. Now we can also breathe through our mouth, and that enters in through our mouth and it joins up again with our pharynx. Okay, air will then move past the voice box down through the trachea, where it can go to the right or to the left. It enters into these airways called bronchi, or plural is bronchi, singular is bronchus. So we have two bronchi. We have a right bronchi and a left bronchus and a right bronchus. Sorry, getting my plurals and singular mixed up. And then as it goes down into the bronchus, here the right bronchus, the bronchus gets smaller and smaller until it branches off into these small little tubes called bronchioles. Okay, and eventually, as air gets down into the smallest little bronchioles, it enters into these little tiny sacs called alveoli. Okay, and then it's the reverse when we breathe air out. Air goes up through the bronchioli, through the bronchus, up the trachea, and then out. All right? Now, breathing through your nose is a longer pathway for air to reach your lungs, but it's actually a better pathway because our air, when we breathe through our nose, has to pass into this hollow group of cavities behind our face. Okay, believe it or not, it's kind of hollow behind our eyes and behind our nose. And those spaces are called sinuses. And inside the sinuses, there are little bones that are covered with very thin skin. These bones and the skin is kept moist through mucus, and there are little hairs on there, and these bones are called turbinate bones. And as air passes over these turbinate bones, the air is warmed, it's moistened, and it's cleaned. Okay, so the cilia will pick up any little debris like dust particles and that sort of thing. And the air, when it's moist, is more able to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide when it reaches the lungs. Okay, so these bones are well supplied with blood, which helps to warm the air. There's mucus in those sinuses, which help to moisten the air and help to remove particles. Okay, so breathing through your nose is actually more beneficial if you can do it. Now, as air passes through these cavities, okay, these sinuses, the air is warmed and moistened, and then it enters into the back of our throat, and that area is known as the pharynx. Right, so that's this area right in here. That's the pharynx. Now you'll notice that the pharynx is joined by the air that would come through your nose as well as the air that goes through your mouth. So we talked a little bit about this area when we talked about digestion. You guys know if you're drinking water, for example, or you're drinking pop or something, and someone makes you laugh or makes you kind of expel air very quickly. If you don't open your mouth, that fluid has to go somewhere, and it can actually come out your nose. I think I may have even mentioned that my youngest son, he loves YouTube. He's always searching YouTube videos, and he came one day and he's like, "Hey, Dad, look at this!" And this guy had eaten some spaghetti, and he could do this little trick where he could have the spaghetti hanging out of his mouth and also out of his nose at the same time. And my son was like, "Oh, is this some sort of trick, uh, trick photography or something?" And no, if we look at the anatomy, it's actually, our nose and our mouth share a common pathway, right? And that's the pharynx. So remember this little flap at the back there, the little hangy thing is called the uvula, and that's supposed to prevent food from going up into the sinuses. Now, air then travels down through the pharynx. Okay, we have the epiglottis. The default position of the epiglottis is open, so air will enter into the trachea. Okay, now the trachea is what we call ventral, and the esophagus, where food and liquid goes, that's dorsal. So as air inflates the trachea is pushed outward, and that should kind of block the esophagus so that air doesn't leak down into your stomach. But of course, it does. Geez, I scared myself there. Probably scared you guys. So what you're seeing there, that's a view from a camera, and that's showing the larynx, the voice box. Okay, so those flaps of tissue there, that's looking down your trachea. So if we were to continue down with the camera, we would end up in your bronchi. So what that's showing is someone obviously singing an off-key note, but what's happening is air is vibrating these little flaps of tissue, and that's what enables you to make sounds. Okay, so the reason you're hearing my voice right now is because I'm allowing air to vibrate these flaps of tissue. And we have muscles. You can see muscles that are attached to those flaps, and they can cause the flaps to open a little bit or a lot. They can cause the flaps to thicken or thin, and that gives us tone to our voice. Now, in most females, these flaps of tissue are thinner and more delicate than in most males. Okay, now this is why most males have a deeper voice than most females, because the thicker that those cartilaginous flaps of the larynx are, the deeper a tone you get. So if anybody in band, if you ever did band in junior high, or if you're in the band now and you are a woodwind player, like a clarinet or an oboe or piccolo, these instruments work by vibrating the reed and then amplifying those vibrations through the bell of the instrument. Saxophone, again, sorry guys, I'm just going through my woodwind instruments in my brain. It's been a long time since I took grade 9 band. But basically it's the same principle. So the reed vibrates and you get tones, right? And that's kind of what happens with our larynx. So our larynx is another name for our voice box. Now the trachea, okay, the trachea or our windpipe sometimes it's called. What I want you guys to make note of is that our trachea has C-shaped rings made of cartilage. Now the reason why there is cartilage in the trachea is this cartilage acts to stiffen the trachea and make sure that it doesn't collapse when there is no air in it. So I want you guys to try this next time you're drinking out of a plastic straw, okay? So what you need to do is you need to put your finger at the bottom of the straw and suck in. And what you'll notice is the straw collapses because of air pressure, okay? So the air pressure, when you take the air out of the straw, the outside air pressure will actually cause the straw to collapse. Now, we don't want that obviously happening inside of our trachea. So if we strengthen the trachea with these ring-like cartilage structures, so cartilage is like the same stuff that's kind of in your ear, and a little stiffer than that, maybe in your nose, the tip of your nose, it would kind of have that consistency. So the stuff that's kind of in the tip of your nose, that would make these rings around the trachea. Okay, and that helps to make it rigid and not collapse when there's no air in it. Now, as air travels down the bronchus, or sorry, the trachea, this is the trachea. Okay, down the trachea, I spelled that wrong, I'm sure. It can then diverge into the right and left bronchus. So bronchus is singular, bronchi is plural. Weird bio fact for the day, the right bronchus is actually larger than the left. Anybody want to think of a reason why the left bronchus would be smaller than the right? What is slightly to the left in that area of the body? What other organ? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you guys got it. The placement of the heart. So the heart would kind of sit right in here. I know that's not the shape of the heart, but you get the idea. The heart would sit right around there, and that's why the left bronchus is a little bit smaller than the right. So a weird fact is if you did inhale something, most often it actually ends up in the left lung rather than the right. This picture here is an interesting picture. Again, it's from one of these scopes, and you can see where the trachea diverges into the right and left bronchus. And notice this ring of cartilage right here around the trachea. Now, after the bronchus, we continue to branch, and we branch smaller and smaller and smaller, and these little tiny branches are called the bronchioles. Now, here is a picture of a person's lung with all the tissue removed, and all that is shown in this picture are the airways. Okay, so again, here you can see the trachea. That's the main windpipe. Okay, here are the large bronchi. So this right here would be my right bronchus, and then this is the left bronchus. Okay, and then all these little, what look like little tiny branches in a tree, all these millions of little tubes, those are the bronchioles. Okay, so the bronchioles are the smallest air tubes. And I want you to make a note of this, please. So highlight this in your note package. These are the types of little questions that get you guys on these exams. It's the little details that you're not getting. Please highlight this. The bronchioles lack the cartilaginous rings found in the trachea and the bronchi. Lack means they don't have them. All right? So the trachea has the cartilaginous rings. The right and left bronchi have those cartilaginous rings, but the bronchioles do not have those rings. They lack them. Instead, these bronchioles are made up of smooth muscle. Okay, they're made of smooth muscle. They don't have those rings. Now, what is smooth muscle? Smooth muscle is a special type of muscle. It's not like the muscles in your bicep and your quads and your pecs and all that kind of stuff. Okay, it's not the muscle that you go into the gym and do curls to make bigger. All right? Smooth muscle is found in our organs for the most part. So we find smooth muscles surrounding our gastrointestinal tract. They're responsible for peristalsis. We find them around our arteries, right? Remember we talked about how arteries are elastic and muscular? That's because they are made of or they're surrounded by these smooth muscles. All right. We also talked about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. I don't know if you guys remember those terms. We'll talk about them here in a second again. Smooth muscle usually comes in flat sheets, and those flat sheets can be folded into a tube. All right. So anywhere we kind of have a tube in our body. So for example, those little bronchioles, arteries, our esophagus, our stomach, our intestines, okay, these are surrounded by smooth muscle. Now, how is smooth muscle different from the muscles in your bicep? Well, smooth muscles only have one nucleus per cell. As we'll see later, that's not the case with our bicep muscles, okay? The other thing is smooth muscles are involuntary. What does involuntary mean? It means you do not have control over them. All right? So you don't have control over when your stomach muscles, the muscles that surround your stomach, when they contract. I'm not talking about your abdominals that are over top your stomach. I'm talking about the actual muscles that are around your stomach. Okay? You don't have any control over whether food moves through your intestines, right? You don't have any control over whether you, when you get embarrassed, you blush, right? What is blushing? It's blood rushing to your face, right? And why does blood rush to your face? Because the arteries in your face relax and blood is allowed to rush in there. Now, how does that happen? Smooth muscles that are surrounding your arteries. Okay, so smooth muscles usually come in sheets. They have one nucleus per muscle cell, and they are involuntary, and they're usually found surrounding organs or in tubes. Okay, so smooth muscles are found in many parts of the body other than the bronchioles. So we find them, as I mentioned, around our digestive system, and they're responsible for peristalsis. We find them in our blood vessels, especially our arteries and arterioles, and this helps to direct blood flow by either vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So remember, vasodilation means the blood vessel gets larger. Vasoconstriction means the blood vessel gets smaller and less blood can go through. It also forms the sphincters of the body. So we talked about the cardiac sphincter, we talked about the pyloric sphincter in the stomach. Okay, these are circular muscles. Actually, we have a sphincter muscle in our eyes. Okay, the colored part of your eye, the iris, those are sphincter muscles. And again, you have no control on whether your iris gets bigger or smaller, right? When you walk into a bright room, it contracts and your iris gets smaller, or your pupil gets smaller because of your iris. Walk into a dark room, pupil gets larger because your iris relaxes. Okay, and then smooth muscle is found in the walls of most internal organs. Now, because the bronchioles don't have that C-shaped cartilage, this means that the muscles that surround these bronchioles, they can become inflamed if there is some sort of infection or some sort of reaction by our immune systems. So those of you out there that have asthma, asthma occurs when these bronchioles collapse. So by the way, these are not blood vessels. I know they might look like blood vessels to you, but the picture that I have up on the screen here, these are bronchioles. So what I want you to notice is the bronchiole is made of a layer of muscle, and you'll notice that there are these little tiny, if you look really closely, there are these little tiny hairs in there. Okay, and those hairs, as we'll find out in a second, are called cilia, and they help to clean your air. Now, if you smoke or vape or smoke marijuana, okay, if you're or sit by a campfire every single day of the week, if you're inhaling impurities, those impurities will be deposited inside your bronchioles, and that can cause inflammation. Notice how the airway of this diseased bronchiole is much smaller than the airway of a healthy bronchiole. Okay, it's obstructed. Now, this is the bronchiole of somebody who's suffering an asthma attack. And notice that the airway is really small. So if you've ever heard someone that is asthmatic, or if you have asthma yourself, if you're having an asthma attack, maybe that can be brought on by exercise. Okay, that can be brought on by an allergic reaction. That can be brought on by impurities in the air, like when we have forest fires in the summertime. What happens is these muscles become inflamed, and these muscles will start to collapse, and that causes the airway to become extremely constricted. And if you've ever heard somebody with asthma that's having an asthma attack, you can hear a high-pitched wheezing when they're breathing in and out, and there's a delay for the air to move in and out, and that's because these airways are so constricted. Now, the bronchioles terminate in little tiny sacs that make up the lung. Now, many people think that your lungs are just these two big balloons, and they're not. Okay? Your lungs are actually about 600 million microscopic balloons. Now, you should be noticing a theme here, ladies and gentlemen. When we talked about um, our small intestine, right? The small intestine wasn't just a smooth tube, right? It had all these finger-like projections. They were called villi. And then on top of the villi, there were microvilli, right? And then when we looked at our kidney, we don't just have two large filters in our body. We have millions of little nephrons, right? So our lungs, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that our lungs aren't just two big balloons. They're actually 600 million little tiny balloons. And I'll give you guys a guess, a wild guess. What does this increase? Instead of just having two big balloons, we have 600 million little balloons. This increases. Just waiting for somebody to throw it up on the message board. Yeah, you got it. Excellent. Way to go. Surface area. That's right. So just like having millions of nephrons and having millions and millions of microvilli, having millions and millions of little tiny balloons in for gas exchange, this increases surface area. All right. So surface area is increased by having these little tiny microscopic air sacs, and they are called alveoli. Okay, alveoli. So our lungs are not just these hollow spaces. They're actually filled with millions and millions and millions and millions of little tiny air sacs called alveoli. And like you guys called it, alveoli help to increase the surface area for gas exchange. So oxygen travels into our lungs through our trachea, through our bronchi, into our bronchioles, and then that air moves into our alveoli. Okay, so this thing right here is called an alveoli. Okay, alveoli. Oh. And we have about 600 million of them. And you can see that they form these little clusters. And when we look at cross section, they are hollow. So when that oxygen enters into these little microscopic alveoli, right, the air travels in here, that oxygen can be exchanged with capillaries that are surrounding them. Okay, so again, notice anywhere we have exchange, we have a capillary network. So if the blood is carrying CO2, like this deoxygenated blood, the CO2 will go into the alveoli. Okay, oxygen is taken out of the alveoli and put into the blood to oxygenate it. So gas exchange occurs at the alveoli. And again, notice the capillaries that are surrounding those alveoli. So like the capillaries that surround them, the alveoli are only one cell thick. This provides an easy passage for gas exchange. It allows oxygen to diffuse into the blood through the alveoli and into the capillaries, and it allows carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the blood and enter into the capillaries, where it would go into the pulmonary vein. No, sorry, deoxygenated blood. So blood with carbon dioxide in it comes into the lungs through the pulmonary artery that's carrying deoxygenated blood. And then oxygenated blood would go back to the heart through the pulmonary vein, right? So this goes back to the heart. And air enters into the bronchiole, where it goes down into the alveoli, and we have that exchange. Okay, so CO2 is brought to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Oxygen is brought to the lungs through the air we breathe. We have gas exchange. Blood, oxygen-rich blood leaves the lungs after gas exchange, and then CO2 would leave the body through the same network of tubes that brought in the oxygen. Now, surrounding the lungs is a membrane called the pleural membrane. So surrounding the lungs is a membrane called the pleural membrane. And the pleural membrane forms a cavity around the lungs, and that cavity is filled with fluid. Now, this has a couple of jobs that it does. Number one, it helps to reduce the friction of the lungs and the chest cavity during breathing. Okay, so you have to understand, every time you inflate your lungs and you deflate your lungs, the lungs are getting larger and smaller, and that would brush up against the inside of your chest cavity, and it would create friction. Like, just try rubbing your hands together for a couple of seconds. It creates heat, right? Imagine if that was your lungs rubbing up against the back of your chest wall, thousands of times a day. So the liquid and the pleural membrane kind of act as a lubricant. Okay. Number two, what the pleural membrane does is it forms a vacuum seal around the lungs. And as we'll see later when we talk about the mechanisms of breathing, breathing depends on air pressure. And if we were to not have this vacuum around the lungs, then air would not rush in and inflate our lungs. Now, sitting right along our rib cage. So if you were to trace your rib cage right now, kind of almost acts like a partition between your chest cavity and your abdominal cavity. There is a large, thin sheet of smooth muscle called your diaphragm. And your diaphragm is kind of shaped like a parachute. And like I said, it's attached to your bottom ribs, and it creates almost like a dome And underneath your diaphragm would be your stomach, and then underneath your stomach would be your small and large intestine. Now, above your diaphragm would be your lungs, and then your heart. Now, the diaphragm is used to change the volume of the pleural cavity during breathing. Okay, so the pleural cavity, that's what your lungs are encased in. When the diaphragm goes down, that increases the volume of the chest cavity, which decreases the pressure and air rushes into your lungs. When the diaphragm goes up into a dome, that kind of squeezes the pleural cavity and it causes the volume to go down, the pressure to go up, and air rushes out. So the diaphragm is made of smooth muscle. You do have a little bit of control over your diaphragm. I know I said earlier that you don't have control over your smooth muscles. Your diaphragm is a bit of an exception to this. You do have control over it. So you can breathe in and out. You can hold your breath if you want to, but you only have control to a certain extent. If you were to hold your breath for too long, eventually your brain would take over and it would cause your diaphragm to contract and relax without your being able to control it. All right. So your subconscious brain will eventually take over control, although you do have a little bit of control over it. All right. So that's today's lecture. What I would like you guys to do for the next little while is in your note packages, I've actually taken these questions and put them into your note package, so you don't have to have your textbook handy. If you look on page 4 of your note package, you will notice that there are a number of questions for homework there. Okay, so please read pages 244 to 248 in your textbook, and then complete these questions on page 4 of your note package.